Welcome to this Western Washington University Fraser Lecture Series event featuring Dr. Christoph Koch. I am Jeff Grimm, Professor of Psychology and Director of Western's Behavioral Neuroscience Program. What does it mean to be conscious? Is consciousness experienced only by humans? What about other animals? What about the Earth itself? Can artificial intelligence experience consciousness? These big questions are being considered and tested by our visiting lecturer today. Dr. Koch is a former chief scientist and president of the Paul Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle. He was trained as a physicist at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen, Germany. After completing graduate school, he continued to work at prestigious universities as a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and a faculty member at Caltech before moving to the Allen Institute. Dr. Koch has made numerous contributions in the field of neuroscience, including creation of the Allen Institute's Open Scope Brain Observatory, co-authoring hundreds of papers, and authoring several books. From a home base on San Juan Island, Dr. Koch continues his collaborations with scientists at the Allen as meritorious investigator and is also the chief scientist of the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation in Santa Monica, supporting research projects on questions related to consciousness and mental health. His recently published book is Then I Am Myself, the World. Please welcome Dr. Koch.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to read the opening, just the opening page or 99 pages from my book. Within seconds, my entire field of view became engulfed by black, swirling smoke. The space around me fractured into 1,000 hexagons and shattered. The speed with which this happened left no time to regret the situation I got myself into. As I was sucked into a black hole, my last thought was, with the dying of the light, I too would die, and I did. I ceased to exist in any recognizable way, shape, or form. No more Christoph, no more ego, no more self, no memories, dreams, desires, hopes, fears. Everything personal was stripped away. Nothing was left but a non-self. This remaining essence wasn't man, woman, child, animal, spirit, or anything else. It didn't want anything, expect anything, think anything, remember anything, dread anything. But it experienced, did it ever. It saw a point of cold white light of unbearable intensity, unable even to conceive of looking away, as there was no away from. There was no light, there was no left or right, up or down, no front or back, no far away or close by. There wasn't a black canvas upon which the light existed, as there was no space. Everything had collapsed into a singularity. There was no other attributes, no color, no motion, no structure, no sound, no silence, no smell, no body, no pleasure, no pain. What there was a timeless universe convulsed to a blazing icy light. That and a profound feeling of both terror and ecstasy. The awfulness of pure experience lasting indefinitely, for there was no perception of time. The experience wasn't too brief or too long, it simply was. So the remnants of my shattered mind perceived the sublime, the burning furnace of being. So this is an experience I had, and it reinforced a number of things. It left me with a profound appreciation that you can be highly conscious without being conscious of self at all. At that point, there was no consciousness of self, as I said, and that Immanuel Kant and other transcendental philosophers were correct, that what this experience showed, that experience of space, the so-called reality of space and time itself is a construct of the brain, and under certain conditions, those constructs can disappear, i.e. every space collapsed and there wasn't any perception of time left for me. The beneficial effect of this, the long-term beneficial effect of this experience was that led to a complete loss of fear or death that persists to this day. This happened in the early days of COVID. So first, as I said, I like to disclose my conflict of interest. I'm the president and have financial interest in a company, Intrinsic Powers, whose purpose is to develop a device to assess the presence of consciousness in behavioral unresponsive patients. I won't really talk about this, except I'll just show one slide. So, as my opening remark emphasized, because people always ask, well, what do you mean by consciousness? Well, I mean, consciousness or awareness, I use them interchangeable. And other words that philosophers have used is subjectivity, mental, phenomenologic. Those are all sort of, they're all cum grano salis, they're all really the same. It's experiences, being in love, in pain, bored, dreading, seeing, hearing, wanting, imagining, dreaming, anything. And everything is consciousness, because it turns out, and this is of course an age-old insight, that the only way you encounter the world, the only way, in fact, you know that you exist, if you think about it, is because you experience, you have experiences. You may be, as René Descartes famously said 400 years ago, you may be deluded about certain aspects of who you are or your effect on other people, etc., etc. But the fact that you are, even if you're deluded, you have already a conscious experience of something. So this is the only way we encounter the world. It's the only thing that we have direct acquaintance with. We don't know about atoms and stars and other beings. All we know directly is my and your conscious experience. That's just the way the world is. Now, it's very important in a clinical context, also in an experimental context, and also with respect to computers, to dissociate, to understand that consciousness, being conscious, is different from acting consciousness. In other words, consciousness can be dissociated from behavior. So usually, when you ask a person in the morning, well, how are you? They respond, I'm fine, or I'm angry, or I'm in pain, or whatever. So in day-to-day interactions with other adult human beings, we rely on speech. Now, of course, this doesn't work if you're dealing with babies or pre-linguistic competent infants. It doesn't work if you're dealing with aphasic patients or other patients. It doesn't work with animals. I mean, you can talk at them, but they can't respond back. But usually among people, it's speech or other voluntary behaviors, like I can signal, even if I'm mute, I can still signal with my hand. Yet there are other experiences that are typically de-emphasized, that involve no behavior whatsoever. Dreaming. So all of you tonight will go first into deep sleep in the early part of the night, when you have these slow delta waves crossing your brain. If I wake you up and I ask you, where did you come from? You didn't come from anywhere. You came from nowhere. You're truly unconscious. And then later on in the night, you'll have these experiences inside your sleeping brain. They're different from everyday experiences. Yourself typically, the self isn't present to the same degree. You can fly, you can walk through walls, and you're not particularly surprised, but you're certainly, whatever you are, you're certainly conscious. But you're not, your brain, in fact, is actively paralyzing your muscle. If you have a condition known as REM behavioral disorder, you act out your dream, which is not good for you or your bad partner. So in meditating, when you're sitting on your cushion, you're totally without any motion, right? You experience, all sorts of conscious states, yet without any behavior. When you're tripping, when you're having, particularly on a high dose psychedelics or ayahuasca or 5-MeO DMT or whatever the case may be, you can be totally immobile, yet you take a trip to the end of the universe, you can encounter demons, you can converse with angels, all without any behavior. Now, of course, we also know from Freud and Nietzsche and others, and studied over the last 150 years, many of our behaviors are unconscious. Either they're reflex-like, or they are so actively repressed or suppressed from consciousness. They're censored for various reasons in our psyche. So the thing to remember, that determining consciousness in others, whether that I infer in you or in babies or in a fetus or in a dog or in a squid, is always an inference, right? Because consciousness is defined by its fact that it's private. Only I have direct access to my feelings. You have to ask me about my feelings, and of course I might be lying for all sorts of reasons. You know this, if you are in a relationship and your partner cheats on you, you may never find out because you don't directly access your partner's mind. And so it's always an inference. Yeah, based on behavior, you guys are also conscious. It would be extremely unlikely only for my brain to give rise to consciousness, but your brain somehow obeys a different law. That doesn't really make any sense. So therefore, it's very rational to infer that. And then we inferred with less certainty in babies, because maybe babies, when they're very young, maybe are not truly conscious. You know, they have cute behaviors, but are they really conscious? Or what about fetuses? And then animals. And then the question is, most people are willing to accord consciousness to dogs and cats and other animals they live with, but how far does it go down the ladder in the tree of life? And then, of course, it comes to the big question of the day, when our intuitions totally fail us, you know, things like ChatGPT, when we simply don't know. They behave like they're conscious, right? They can eloquently tell you about their conscious experience, but of course, they crib that from all the humanities novels that they have read and ingested and can, you know, spew back at you. But that doesn't mean they actually feel like anything. In fact, I think they feel as much as my vacuum disposal. So it's always what's called a probabilistic inference to the best explanation. So what's important is to remember in experimental context, whether you're a psychologist and study animals like Jeff and other people do, or whether you're in the clinic where you have behavioral unresponsive patients, that unresponsiveness is, so I don't know what is repeated, it's different from unconsciousness. Okay, so as I said, I mentioned this is true in dreaming, this is true in meditation, this is true in patients. So turns out that if you have a traumatic brain injury due to car accident, let's say, or your cardiac arrest or hemorrhage, you go to the ICU, then some people can be saved. They're definitely alive, typically on a ventilator, but they're now behavioral unresponsive. This used to be called vegetative state. It's now called behavioral unresponsive state, where, you know, you're just like this. You may have almost no motion left. You know, even if you shine the light into the eyes or you pinch them, you may not have a response. So typically these people are considered unconscious. And in this country and also in Europe, if you remain in this state for more than 4 to 5 days, the medical team will initiate discussion with the family about discontinuing life support, and 80 to 90% of people who survive the initial insult, but they remain in this acute state for 4 to 5 to 6 days, they are the doctor withdraw life support and they die. Although we now know from this last series of studies, the last one in the New England Journal of Medicine, that up to 25% of these patients are actually conscious, yet they're unable to express themselves because of the damage. They can't talk, they either may not hear you or can't do whatever they're being asked to do, or simply could do it, but their motor cortex has been destroyed by their insult, like in this patient. All right, so as I mentioned, this is my daughter with a beloved German Shepherd. So we inferred in non-human animals because their behavior is similar, right? They can bark, they can wag with their tail. We don't have a tail to wag, but sort of we can, you know, we can understand they're similar to us. They're mammals, after all. We all share common heritage. You know, we're only 65 million years apart. Their brain architecture, if I give you a little piece of dog brain or mouse brain or human brain or elephant brain, it's indistinguishable without a microscope. And even with a microscope, if I remove the scale bar, because some brains are bigger than others, once I normalize them to the same size, the basic architecture is exactly the same. I mean, it's very, very similar. We're all nature children. The basic blueprint of cortex across mammals is remarkably similar. Close evolutionary relationship. What we have is true language, sense of developed sense of self, and an overly developed sense of our own importance. Now, the problem with consciousness is because it's subjective, because it's private, I don't really know how you experience the world. And we know from 200 years of psychology that people experience the world in all sorts of different ways, even though we may be looking at the same thing. So you probably all have seen this, right? Who sees this as blue and black? Well, okay, so about half. And who sees it as white and gold? All right, so it's quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable what delusions people can have, because there's certainly no blue and black here. So, I mean, this is a fun thing. It's a phenomenon. It was on Tinder in 2015 and went viral because by chance we discovered that half of humanity, roughly, sees it in one way, gold and white, like I do. And it's not that you have to think about it or reason about it. It's just obvious, white and gold. There's no other about it. And the other half of humanity sees it equally. Well, of course, it's blue and it's blue and black. So then people ask me, well, what's the real color? Well, there is no real color here. What there are photons, in this case from the light, from the sun, that strikes this dress and then gets reflected into our eyes, and then our eyes processes the relative catch of these photons, these wavelength-dependent photons, and adjust it and gives rise to what we interpret as color, which is a property of surfaces, right? You know, here this is blue and yellow, for instance. And it turns out that people do it in different ways. And some people, having to do with the background assumption, where you implicitly assume it's dark or bright. But so it's just a different, it's a different way it's processed in our brain. Now, this is fun here, and you can show it at parties, but what's true for color is also true for everything else, and this is particularly relevant in the social world. You know, we live now in a very polarized society where people fundamentally see the same facts. Reasonable people completely differ on the facts. So if I tell you January 6th, right, and depending whether you're a Trump supporter or, let's say, a Democratic supporter, you will have a fundamental different interpretation of January 6th. Or if you live, you know, in Israel or in Gaza, and I tell you October 7, you will come to fundamental different views on what October 7 means. So the same facts are interpreted very differently. So what that means, the reality we perceive is a construct of our brain. It is not given. There isn't sort of a naive one-to-one mapping between a true objective reality and our conscious experience of it. Reality is constructed by the mind and with its substrate, the brain, and different brains, depending on their genetics, and then depending on their early childhood experiences, the culture, the expectation, can take the same input and interpret it in a very different way. And we find it difficult to explain, to understand that. Well, why don't you see, look at all these facts. Obviously, they tell me this. And to someone else will say, no, it really means that. And then you can clash unless you understand, yes, people have this. So I use this nice metaphor of the perception box from Elizabeth Koch, no relationship. That our brain constructs this reality called the perception box, and we each live in our own bespoke perception box, and it can be very different. And it can be also very, I mean, here in this case, a beautiful illusion. So just fixate the cross at the center. Just don't move your eyes all over. Just look at the cross, the black cross at the center. And then tell me what you see. What do you see? Do you see a single traveling disk? So if you really keep your eyes steady, what you should see, what most people see, is a single traveling disk instead of 11 magenta disks in one hole. Do most of you see that? So here is a simple distinction between what's out there and what you perceive. So what there are these 11 magenta disks and a hole, and then this hole travels. But what your brain sort of finally perceives, due to various reasons that we understand pretty well, is a single green traveling disk. So what's there isn't what you see, and what you see isn't there. And this is just, in general, the relationship between the external world and what we perceive is, it's not random, because otherwise, you know, we couldn't exist in the same world. I'm always highly aware of that, you know, when you travel on the 5, or when you travel more relevant on a small highway where there's no central divider and two cars are passing each other at, you know, each 60 miles per hour, that's 125 miles closing velocity. If we didn't agree on reality, this situation wouldn't last for very long, right? So obviously, most of the time, because we evolved in we sort of tend to have many things consensual. There is a consensual reality. It's not random. But in many things, in particular when it comes to the social world, this consensual reality can depend greatly on your particular upbringing, your early childhood experiences. And of course, you're not aware of that because that's just the way the world is. Just like a colorblind person doesn't realize they're colorblind until, you know, they realize that other people see the world differently, because you assume, well, of course this is how the world should be viewed. I mean, how can you see it as anything else? So we each live in our own reality, and this is now well known in science, the idea of the Umwelt. Immanuel Kant talks about this, that even space and time, which we think is sort of absolute given by physics. No. I mean, of course, we know since relativity theory of Einstein, there is no absolute position. Even space and time can disappear in certain experiences, like this sort of near-death experience I describe in the opening pages. So there are all sorts of ways. Today, the most popular one is called free energy principle. And then I use this perception box of Elizabeth Koch, who sort of is the founder of the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation. So once again, we all construct our, there's one thing I want you to take from this talk, is that our perceived reality is a constructed reality. It's constructed by the brain. It's not a passive process. It's an active process of active but unconscious inference. We don't think we construct it. The world just presents it. You know, I don't have to infer. I just look out and see or experience things. But in fact, it's a huge amount of processing that's going on by our brain. But the conscious output, the only thing I experience of it is the world as it is. We think it's given, but it's not given. But you can change it. So your beliefs can affect the world. So you can expand the world of your perception box, or you can shrink it. And it's active. You are the own agent of you. You have agency. You can change your perception of reality. There are procedures, there are interventions, if you just have the desire really to change it. You're not sort of passive actor in this movie of your life. You can actively construct a narrative. We know this, for example, people call this, do you all know what the placebo effect is? So people, doctors particularly, they usually they say, well, that's just a placebo effect, right? The fact that I can give you a little sugar pill and I say, well, you know, this is a powerful substance, and I'm a doctor and I have a nice gold label, Dr. So-and-so, and I wear a white lab coat, and your friends, you've heard from your friends that this little pill does wonders, then it's likely to help you to do a lot of good. And of course, the opposite, the dark shadow of the placebo, so nocebo, where if you think something is hurting you, more likely than not, it will have a detrimental effect. What that tells us that our belief, what we believe about a medical procedure or an intervention, can reach all the way throughout our body, can affect our gut, our entire organs, and of course also the perception of our world. And you see that in all sorts of mental conditions. So these are the brains we study. I mean, in general, neuroscience study, the most popular one. This is also what we do at the Allen Institute. This is the human brain, obviously. This is 1,000 times the smaller the mouse brain. Believe me or not, they are really very similar. This one is 1,000 times bigger, but of course, we are not the biggest brain. Elephants and blue whales have brains that are far bigger. And so we have to do all sorts of logarithmic scaling to make sure on these scales we come out on top. Because we like to be always at the top. That's human desire. All right, so many years ago when I was a young man, I worked for 14 years with Francis Crick. So he's the British man who, together with Jim Watson, discovered the double helical nature of the molecule of heredity, DNA, and then, of course, also helped decipher the genetic code of life. And then when he retired at age 16, went from Cambridge, UK to La Jolla, he turned his mind to this other great unknown, consciousness, and we wrote a whole series of papers where we focused on, this is many years ago, before, at that point, I hadn't yet obtained the holy state of tenure. I was still an untenured faculty at Caltech, where I did what people typically, or I was told, you only do if you either have a Nobel Prize or you're a retired professor, namely study consciousness. And here we just articulated an purely empirical program to study the footprints of consciousness in the brain. We felt it was scandalous that that consciousness was left to philosophy and to mystics or to theologians. Because it's such a central aspect of my life, we need to have scientific theories of consciousness, and let's study it. Let's just first do good old tracking. This is empirical science, and sooner or later we'll get the answer. We'll know what the neural correlates of consciousness are, the neural correlates of consciousness. And it's causal in the sense that once I know it's these neurons vibrating in this particular frequency in that part of the brain, well, if I then intervene with some sort of surgical technology or neuro-like technology, I should be able to induce the effect. Or if I prevent this mechanism from occurring, then I should prevent the conscious experience from happening using optogenetics or electrical stimulation or whatever. So this has become a very popular thing now in science. There are hundreds of labs that quest for these NCCs. And there's all sorts of controversy. This is coming out in Nature, a big article in a couple of months from now. I won't bother you with that. I already mentioned this, the need, as I said, 25% of these patients, of these behavioral unresponsive patients are conscious. So now that we know something about the neural correlates of consciousness, we can design tools to probe, to sort of have a biomarker to test for the presence of consciousness in the clinic. And some of our team members here in Milan are actually testing that, but I won't talk more about that. This is a very important problem because, as I said, so many of these patients end up dying by voluntarily withdrawal of life-critical support. All right. So once again, if it's true that consciousness really does not necessarily can be dissociated from behavior, because ultimately consciousness, and this really is also relevant for computers, consciousness is not about doing. Consciousness ultimately is about being. Being in love, being happy, seeing, fearing, dreading, etc. Sometimes you can do something about it, but very often, as I said, you just dream or you just enjoy your conscious experience. And this is now recognized that in psychology, cognitive neuroscience, there are these no-report paradigms where the patient doesn't, or the subject doesn't do anything except just experience, and you can look at the neural footprints in fMRI or in other techniques. All right, you may have heard, so this made it to the New York Times. So this is a famous philosopher, David Chalmers, who popularized the idea of the heart problem. So the heart problem is trying to understand why any one particular mechanism in the brain, no matter what it is, why that particular mechanism, empirically we might know that this mechanism, whenever you turn on these neurons over here, let's say, you have the feeling of being in love, fine. But why should activity here give rise to feeling in love, and over here it's pain, and over here it's boredom, and yet activity in my heart doesn't give rise to anything, or in my liver doesn't? I mean, why? There's this non sequitur. There is what he calls this gap, this explanatory gap that you can't cause between the physics of the system, the brain or whatever it is, on the one hand, and the experience on the other. He called this the heart problem, and he argues that it's impossible hard. And 27 years ago, when he and I, we were both 27 years younger, we attended a conference, did an all-night pub crawl, and I said, look, Dave, this is silly. Of course we'll solve this problem. In 25 years, I was much younger. I believed in I had started my lab, and of course we're going to lick this problem. No problem. 25 years we'll solve it. We'll find the neural correlates of consciousness, and we bet 6 bottles of good wine. And so I had to concede at a big conference in New York City 2 years now ago. I had to concede that I lost this and gave him 6 bottles of 1988 Madeira. But he admits that this is just a question of time. Finding the footprints of consciousness is not hard. That's just difficult, and it may be costly, and it's tricky for methodological reasons, but this is not a hard problem. This we will solve, and he admits this. All right, so once we solve this, the neural footprints of consciousness, so what do I mean with that? Sooner or later, we'll discover these neurons or these subcomponents of neurons, or maybe even these quantum mechanical mechanisms, those are the ones that give rise to pain or pleasure or feeling or whatever. Then I also need to explain why some give rise to boredom and the other one a feeling of eating leftover pizza, or the feeling of dread or any other feeling, right? Because that also needs to explain not only why certain physical systems have these particular mental states, but why do they have this state and not that state out of all the possible states. And there's this very powerful theory that I was heavily involved in that I talk about in this book called integrated information. That's sort of a scientific theory that's very different from the dominant paradigm today in academia and in tech, which is that computational functionalism, which is the idea that consciousness is a function, or has one or more functions. Those functions can be instantiated on a Turing machine, on a computer, and so it's just a clever hack. It's only a question of having the right algorithm on the right architecture, running it on a digital machine in the cloud, and they'll be conscious. So that's why, at least in tech, and in many academic conferences, they assume, well, it's a given that soon machines will be conscious, which I think is all wrong. They'll be intelligent, maybe, or super intelligent even, but it's all deep fake. It's all pseudo-consciousness. They behave like if they're conscious, but they're faking it. All right. So there are all sorts of interesting scientific theories here we could go, and scientific questions we can go into, theoretical aspects. We need a theory that tells us which physical bits and pieces of matter have sentience and what type of sentience. We can explore the question that I'm very involved in, is quantum mechanics, particular things like entanglement, Bell's pairs, etc. For the expert. Is that necessary to explain consciousness? Probably not, but we don't know until it's tested. How widespread is consciousness in the tree of life? Is it just us and maybe, charismatic megafauna like eagles and dogs and whales and cats and a few other select species that we happen to like? Is it all mammals? Is it all, does it include birds or cephalopods, squids, octopus, right? They can have very complex behavior. What about bee? I love bee. Only has 1 million neurons compared to 86 billion, but they can do very complicated things, can do the waggle dance. Does it feel like something to be a bee when you've just drunk some golden nectar and you're flying in the warm sun back to your sisters in the hive? I think so, but how far does it go? Does it go all animals, all single cell creatures, everyone on the tree of life? Does it feel like something to be a giant sequoia? And then, of course, the question of the ages, will computers be conscious? But those are all topics we could talk about. But I wanted to talk on transformative experiences, where a radical change in your consciousness can lead to a long-term change in your life, your goals, the way you perceive your wellness, your well-being. So we know that change is difficult, right? Many of us are trying to lose weight or eat better or drink less or smoke less or do less of other addictive behavior. And we know it's difficult, it's challenging. So here we have, and this is throughout history, we have brief and unexpected experiences. Brief, I mean under an hour typically, usually unexpected. They can be totally spontaneous, like on a mountaintop, suddenly you get hit by this. That can lead to permanent changes in your attitudes, your goals, your beliefs, and your habits. So loss of fear of death, loss of anxiety, loss of cynicism, detachment from material possession, and orientation towards the greater good, eusocial. So these are positive, because of course you can have a car accident, which is brief and unexpected, but it's not beneficial. So these are things that people perceive as being profoundly positive in a sense. They can all tell you there's a distinct before and after for the rest of this life. And most people will say these experiences are among the most meaningful, together with when they got married or the birth of their first child. So this is throughout history you can find these in the literature. This includes religious conversion experiences. Traditionally, it was mainly talked about in the context of religious conversion experience. Mystical experience, aesthetic experiences, near-death experiences. So the phenomenology, how does it feel like? Well, typically, what's called ocean. So this is, it sounds very poetic. It's now a technical expression, oceanic boundlessness, where yourself, typically you have no self, and you feel the boundaries extend. There are no more boundaries. So one of the things that we never think about, because it's such a basic part of our furniture, of our mental life, is their boundaries. Even, you know, if you shake someone's hand, you definitely know this is not my hand, this is not my body. Even when you're making love to somebody, your body penetrates, you know there's another body, it's not your body. And this can disappear, this boundary between self and others can disappear, where you perceive there is you are part of the world. This is the title, then I'm myself a world, which refers to different experience, which incidentally is taken from Richard Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde, where in the second act, Tristan and Isolde want to overcome their distinctive nature. Tristan wants to become Isolde, and Isolde wants to become Tristan. They have this longing, which is of course expressed in the Tristan chord. And then at some point, to the most rapturous music composed in the Western canon, they become one, and they become with the universe. Selbst dann bin ich die Welt. And I just love that title. So the phenomenologists, you lose yourself. Typically, there's no more self. It can be pure bliss or sometimes terror, pure terror, or sometimes both. And you've got to remember the etymology of awful, full of awe. Right? It's this combination of bliss and terror. Being in the theologians have an expression, mysterium tremendum, being in the presence of God, the overwhelming presence of God, which can induce this combination of bliss and terror. Loss of perception of time and space, so typically time is gone, space may be gone, the external world typically is gone, sense of self, and some people encounter spirits or divine messengers. Now, who's willing to say that they've had such experiences? Oh, quite a few. Okay. Yeah, so it's not that uncommon. I mean, until 30 years ago, people simply didn't have a language to talk about them. And I remember early on going, it was typically in bookstores in the remote back part, under occult sciences. No, I'm serious, witchcraft, and sort of things like that, and ESP, there were sort of description of this because people thought, well, this is completely woo-woo. It's not. It is, many people, a significant number of people have reported it. You can go back in the literature, like the classical one, of course, is this one, right? So this is a famous picture in Rome, at the altar of, what's his name? I saw it, I took this picture, which is the conversion of Saul, right, who was a persecutor of Christians on the road to Damascus, where he fell off his donkey and may have had, that's one, thanks, that's one interpretation, but had this religious conversion experience where then he became, from Saul, the persecuted Christian, its greatest apostle, right? So this is a classical, and there are many people, you know, these are primarily within the Christian tradition, but of course not only, there's also Rumi and Khalil Gibran. You can find these conversion experiences in any religious experiences, not just Christian. Then there are these, so this is William James, the father of American psychology. It's this fantastic book written early in the last century, The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talks about experiences. He calls them mystical experiences, where you feel you become one with the absolute. I had an experience like this on a beach in Bahia in Brazil at midnight, where I literally lost everything. It totally recalibrated the ontological, the way I think about the world. Only happened 5 years ago. And typically at my age, your view of the world is very, very stable. So I was utterly amazed when suddenly I think about things now very, very differently. Just one experience, half an hour or something. So you can go to websites. There are lots of websites with endless description of very, famous or not so famous people who talk about. So this totally spontaneous. Jane Goodall, the lady who studies chimps, completely spontaneous. Just sitting there in the forest, looking at them, suddenly boom. Experience is sublime in the 19th century. Very often happens in, you know, in the mountains, viewing a mountainscape. You can have that. And then I came across Arthur Schopenhauer, a famous German idealist in the 19th century, who talks about, you know, in his main work, monumental work, The World as Will and Representation. He's an idealist, where he talks about, this is exactly my experience. The person who's involved in this perception is no longer an individual. For in such perception, the individual has lost himself. He's purely will-less, painless, timeless subject of knowledge. And then near-death experiences. Let me cut this. So again, near-death experience used to be thought as totally crazy, but we now know that up to 10% of people, at least that experience cardiac arrest in the hospital and survive. The other ones can't tell us about, of course. Those survive come back with these experiences of tunnel, bright light. Sometimes their life flashes in front of them. Sometimes they encounter strange beings, but very meaningful. And typically it profound, you know, if you're typically older people in hospital, you know, very often they have fear of death, etc., and usually it transforms them. They become radiant, and they may pass away several months later, but having a radical different attitude to their death. Oh yeah, there's just a recent book came out. Sebastian Junger, the war correspondent who's written "War Gives Us Meaning" and "The Perfect Storm." He had a near-death experience and talks about it in this book that came out last fall. I can warmly recommend it. Yeah, so I talked already about the phenomenology. That's just more detailed. So what triggers it? So it turns out if you go back into throughout different cultures, it's a remarkable set of techniques that people have developed to obtain these altered states, to have transformative experiences. So this early Christian hermit movement in 3rd and 4th century, let's say in Jordania and Syria, where they would socially isolate for 10 years, or they would live in a tiny cave or on a platform, the Stagalites, you know, where they lived by themselves for years. Self-flagellation in Western Europe and following the Black Death. In Japan, you have this weird phenomenon of self-mummification, where over 2 years, people of this particular Buddhist sect eat this extreme restricted resin diet, where finally they pass away. So they go every day in this underground chamber, and once a day they ring a bell, and food is the special prepared food, where finally when the bell stops ringing and they die, they are these desiccated mummies, sort of this process of self-mummification. It's an extreme form of restriction. It's amazing that people can do this voluntarily to obtain these states. Chanting and ecstatic dancing, very prominent, whether it's whirling dervishes in the Sufi tradition, clubbing, rave, Burning Man, EDC, it's all the same. I mean, you know, it might strike you as being sacrilege to mix those together, but I think the intention of many of these, whether it's Burning Man or EDC or dwelling dervishes, is to induce by this repetitive motion and other techniques to induce this altered state of loss of sense of self. Social ritual, dancing, with or without consuming substances, whether it's Pentecostal, charismatic Christian churches, or you know the ayahuasca churches where it's combined with ayahuasca. Holotropic. Who has tried holotropic breath work? Very few. It's amazing. You can take a normal person like me. You breathe. I do this for half hour. After 20 minutes, you totally dissociate. And 10 minutes later, you're in this complete ecstatic state, completely gone. And then you stop, and 2 minutes later, you're back to normal. It is the most amazing, one among the more amazing experiences I've had. Totally just by regulating your pH, and that's essentially what you're doing, and the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Very reliable. Was developed partly after LSD was declared illegal in this country. Physical exertion, I love this. You know, you all know if you do ultra marathons, long distance running, climbing, etc., you can go into these states of flow that are profoundly positive, partly because you experience the world without the self getting in the way. Yeah, lots of ways: sweat lodge, sauna, controlled hypothermia, sensory deprivation, dark retreats. Do you know what that is? This is where you go into dark cave. You can do it in Oregon, you could do it in Colorado. It's sort of a rare, little-known Buddhist technique. It's pretty intense. You go for 5 days into a cave, complete dark, so no books, no media, of course. You're by yourself. Once a day, someone brings by something for you to eat, and that's it. You're just by yourself for 5 days in the complete dark. It's intense. You encounter yourself, because there's nothing else but you. In the 19th century, it was opium, hashish, nitrous oxide, DSL ether. Today it's psilocybin, LSD, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, you know, the toad, ayahuasca. So there are all sorts of ways that people, I'm getting too long here. Let's skip all that good stuff. So the point is there are many different techniques that people have developed and are developing to reach, for all sorts of purposes, both to reach these mystical states of expanded consciousness, but also now for therapeutic efficiency, for if you're depressed, if you have childhood trauma. So if you go online at clinicaltrials.gov, there are roughly more than 100 trials, clinical trials, primarily using psilocybin, but not only. There's also ayahuasca, which is a combination of DMT and monoamine oxidase inhibitor, a couple of ibogaine, 1 or 2 LSDs, really primarily psychedelic, psilocybin for major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant disorder, generalized anxiety, migraines, panic attacks, childhood experiences, all sorts of mental conditions. So this raises all sorts of really interesting questions. So what is it you can bring back from this mystical experience? Why can they be so powerful? And I'm not going to answer that. I'm just going to list some of the questions. Can you actually bring back some genuine new knowledge? Because it is true, as William James already said 100 years ago, and I can myself ascertain this, these experiences bring back as something whose authority you cannot deny. You have been there. You cannot expect anyone else to believe you what you have experienced. That's fine. For you, it has the absolute, the stamp of truth. This is what I experienced. This is what the world is truly like. And then, you know, if you're still trying to use reason to understand the world, you have to see how you can integrate this knowledge that you have obtained with the rest of the knowledge about science and the way the world supposedly works. And what truly exists, is it truly the physical that exists? That's what physicalism says. That's the dominant mainstream, you know, aka materialism. That's the dominant mainstream metaphysical belief. Or is it dualism? So most people are dualist. Or is it idealism, that what truly exists is only the mental, and the physical is just a manifestation of the mental, or variants of thereof? Yeah, and you can experience this profound, you can experience old facts that you knew about, but abstractly in a very concrete, vivid way, like the startling beauty of the natural world, the unexplained miracle of existence, the fact that anything exists rather than nothing, which is completely unexplained. And of course, you have now direct acquaintance with things like that self, space, and time are constructs of the mind, because you've been there. And you've been there when you encounter, at least that's your experience, an ultimate phenomenal reality that is very difficult to deny. So, after the ecstasy, the laundry, it's a title of a famous book by the Buddhist Cornfield. Because, okay, you've had this experience, you encountered, you know, the mind, the cosmic mind, God's mind, or whatever. So now you go back and still, you know, pay taxes and take out the trash. So that's a problem. You know, how do you integrate this experience now? Because it's not just this one experience. It is now comes the work, because you constantly think about it. You know, this experience is so powerful that you constantly have to it's a new fact now that has supreme authority, so you try everything else you've learned or you read about the world, you're trying to figure out, well, how does it relate to this? So that can lead to a massive transformation of your worldview. So, and for me as a scientist, I had all sorts of other interesting questions. So now I'm organizing several conferences to work in foundational physics, because as some of you may know, in quantum mechanics, particularly since the last couple of years ago, with around entanglement, Bell's inequality, it has become more and more apparent that the observer is not just a disinterested part that happens to be present at any experiment. It is the observer is an absolute part of reality. In fact, some physicists go as far to ascertain now that there are no absolute events. In other words, every event in space-time itself depends on an observer observing that. Without an observer, there is no event. There may be superposition of different events, but not a particular event that happened at a particular place in a particular time. So how do we incorporate that into our understanding of physicalism? Then, of course, what are the neuronal, the brain conditions that lead to these dissociative boundaries when you feel you're part of the universe at large? Is it true that all these different states really have the common substrate? Can we develop techniques to routinely access mystical state, and in particular to exploit them for therapeutic purposes, like depression, childhood trauma, etc.? But I think what's really most important, that we need to be humble, we need to have humility as scientists and as scholars. There are many more things. The world is much more complex than not only than we can imagine. This is a wonderful quote. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than I dreamt of in your philosophy. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much. That was a lot of really interesting, informative discussion of philosophy and neuroscience and physics and so I got to do some processing here. We do have a few minutes for some questions. I have some that were submitted when people RSVP'd for the event, and there's a couple on the Zoom, and given that we just have like a few minutes, I'm going through here, and I'll start with this one. What differentiates an experience like a hallucination or extreme state of ecstasy from being labeled a transformative experience versus a symptom of mental illness? It's not my question, but it's a good one.
No, it's a very good one, because if you go on a closed ward, you see people, you see, for example, religious mania, extreme form, where they claim they have constantly these experiences, but then, so partly you can see them by their fruits. People that I know, at least, and that I've read about, that had one mystical experience, typically they go on and lead productive life. They may now, their course has changed fundamentally. They become, something very different. They pursue different aims, but they're highly successful in that. Religious mania and other forms of extreme dissociation, psychotic symptoms, they usually end up, with heavy medication, or in the worst case, in an institution. So I think practically that's one way to differentiate them. Most people will only have one or two of these experiences in their truly transformative experiences in their life. It's not, you can't constantly transform yourself, right? But it's a good question, because there are these, there's certain overlap, or there can be overlap.
And the cultural components too. I'll keep going from this list, and this is very existential. In relating to what you've been talking about, someone asked, how do I let go of extreme fear of death in the context of your discussion?
So all I can say empirically, people who had near-death experiences, many of them, report loss of fear of death, and it's not quite clear why. It's not so, for example, in my near-death experience that I described in opening, it's not that I was given a view of paradise, and I know, when I'm going to die, I'm going to play in the Garden of Eden. No, it's just, I don't know, I find it very difficult to explain. If you read a couple of their papers, learned papers written on this question, how is it that you can lose your fear of death? And it's not entirely clear why. Maybe because you've experienced it and you can still see the world is still present and it's okay for you. You're just here for a little bit, 100 years, plus minus 10 years, and that's okay. You just find that fact now before it terrified you. Then after this, you feel, yeah, that's just how life is.
That's how
it's very difficult to explain why it should be.
I was thinking of, you had some quotes from William James, and when you read over his experience, he went through several early and then midlife crises with that particular, and one of the things he talks about is the settling on, well, I really don't know the answer, and that's okay. I think he said, what if?
Well, yeah, that's pragmatism.
So he became a pragmatist like
he
his
became
dad.
pragmatist where he just said, well, I don't know.
And rather than I don't know, and that's horrible, it's like, I don't know, and that's...
I mean, Schopenhauer, in response to this question, Schopenhauer has this beautiful metaphor for end of life. So he argues, well, consciousness is like this gigantic river. Think about the Mississippi or the Amazon, and there are these little eddies, these whirlpools, and they have a particular existence. They last for a day or two or an hour, and they think they're there forever. But of course, ultimately, something happens and they dissolve. But the individual particles that make up that whirlpool, they go back, become part of the river. And that's somehow, I don't know what you feel after this experience. It's very difficult it's ineffable. It's famously ineffable. You can't put it in words. You can only describe the net effect
of it all. I would be happy to take one question from the audience. I know I'm like being blinded here. Does anybody, come on. Super loud. Projecting all the feet.
How do you conceptualize consciousness in someone who has split on multiple personalities? Is it one consciousness? Is it many? Is it an overlapping the head?
So with the multiple, there's a different name for that.
DID,
Yeah.
dissociative identity disorder. It's a very good question. So I've interacted recently with someone who presents as female, and she can switches instantaneous into a male personality, and then they switch on and off, and they have different voice, different inflection. He talks much lower, she talks much higher. It's always the same person. And they tell this story where he originally grew up somewhere in a rural area and was a boy, and then at 17 she first essentially she was born. That's the first time she realized she was conscious, and then she dominated, and then he disappeared. And this is always a question I have. I don't know what the answer is. There are two possibilities. One is they switch. They have these alternate, for 10 seconds they're one, and then for 5 seconds they're the next, and then for the next 20 seconds they're again the first person. And that I find, that's not so difficult to explain. Usually I must say these people have very bad, almost always have had very bad childhood experiences, unfortunately. And as reaction to that, they appear to develop this. The more difficult to understand interpretation would be there are actually two consciousness that are present in the same brain. So a little bit like split brain. So we know if a surgeon cuts the corpus callosum, which are the 200 million fibers that connect the left and the right cortical hemispheres, we know, of course, you get the left speaking one, but the right one is also conscious. It can sing, it can answer simple questions, and there are two conscious minds now that are totally separate. And is DID more like that there are two minds vying for dominance, because only one can control the Broca area that actually talks? I don't know, it hasn't really been investigated. It's for the people who have it, it's one way apparently how they've coped with terrible events.
Okay. Well, on that happy note.
Maybe we should end with something more.
Yeah,
it's a positive question.
Well, we're right on time, so I'll stop there. But I think we're going to hang out for a few minutes if you want to have a couple, little This is my book, actually. Or if you have your book, if you want to get it signed, hang around. So those of you on Zoom, thanks for showing up, and we'll move on. And I want to thank the Fraser Foundation Funds for bringing Christoph here. And we had a great day. There's several faculty and a lot of students that were able to interact. Super fun.
The best possible weather ever.
Oh my gosh, the weather. Think earlier this week that we might have had. So it's been great. So thank you again, Christoph, for being with us.
Thank you.